Last evening and night in Brussels was good. Not everybody is still ready for our morning session, but I hope that they will join, because we are starting with really, I think, well, I don't know even how to name it. The best part of what we're doing during those 2 days, I would call, that a lot of audiences in Europe this morning would envy what we shall have now. Creme la creme of Russian history. That's, really very important for us in order to understand what is happening in Russia today and what will happen tomorrow. I don't think that there is a very big need to introduce two speakers of this morning. I will tell Orlando Figes, for me, is a teacher of Russian history. I mean, teacher, not he. We how to say, we met on Zoom a few days ago, but I grew up, but my knowledge about Russia grew up, while reading Orlando Figes, starting from People's Tragedy, then, Crimea War, then Natasha Dance, Russia History Recent Book, Europeans, and so on and so on. Really, that's free advertising of read Orlando Figes. And of course, Boris AKUNIN, well, I will try to pronounce real name without any mistake. Grigory Chkhartashvili. That's correct? Yeah. Okay, good. So, of course, again, very well known not only for Russian audience, but for international audience. Great writer, great historian. As I understood, now really is working. That will be the 10th volume of your series on exactly on 1917 and till later decades. And somebody is calling, at least in our discussions, was calling Boris AKUNIN Solzhenitsyn in positive terms of new times in Russia. So, well, that's for us. It sounds very good, and we shall have 1 hour of conversation of two great writers, two great historians, and let's enjoy this early hour. Thanks a lot, and I will leave you both.
Thank you. Thank you. Спасибо. Так, начнем сразу без предисловий, да?
So let's start without any introductory words. Orlando is going to be speaking English and I'm going to be speaking Russian. Do you copy? We need your mic. It won't move. And you have another one on your left side. Is it better? No, it's not. Speak louder, please. What about this sound quality? Not good enough? Speak louder, please. What about now? It is still bad. Orlando, please try it. Do you copy?
The language in which the speaker speaks, so you will hear them much better.
Okay.
That might be a solution.
А теперь слышно? Теперь...
Do you copy now? They say you'd better wear your headphones, then you will hear it better. The problem is that nobody wants to listen to historians and to learn lessons of history. That's the issue. Please let me know. Do you copy? Loud and clear. Can we start? Hooray. So here we have the people who have gathered here to discuss the day of today and the day of tomorrow, the day after. Orlando and I are the people who look at today through the optics of the past. We try to find the roots, reasons, and based on the past, we try to guess the trends and to see what is going on in the future. That's the purpose of history, in my view. I write books, and Orlando is a historian, but we have our cross-cutting efforts because Orlando's and my books are about history, and our audiences are the same, and we do the same job. We try to reflect on history. We try to figure out historical processes. And the key question that all of us have today is why this Ukrainian tragedy outbroke, why this war is going on, why Europe from the 21st century jumped back into the 20th century. This is the first topic to be discussed today. Second, we'll try to see whether there are any resemblances with what we had in the past. And we'll try to forecast, based on history, what is going to be the end of it and what's going to be the progress of it. Orlando, could you please dwell on your point of view? Tell us your explanation of the crisis we observe today. Thank you. Do you copy?
I think this war is Putin's project and has been from the beginning of his third state of presidency in 2012 at the very least. I think my understanding of the war is historical, that he's come to this war through a set of historical imperial mythologies. But I don't think they're anything new. I think I would like to address some of the issues that we talked about yesterday from a historical point of view in order to contribute perhaps to how one changes the political culture in Russia, which was something discussed yesterday. And I think it has to begin actually with history, with the Russians' understanding of their own history. George Orwell wrote in 1984 that who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. And Putin, from very early on in his presidency, seized control of the historical narrative with Ministry of Education control of textbooks, with the propagandization of his master historical narrative, which I believe led him to this war. And it's a well-known narrative because it's an old one. His ideas in that infamous essay of July 2021 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians is basically 19th century Russian imperial historiography. You can find it in Karamzin, you can find it in Solovyov. And so that narrative has at times spilled over into messianic wars. The Crimean War, you kindly mentioned, Andres, my book on Crimea. I mean, this was in itself a sort of prehistory of this war. And let's hope that Putin goes the same way as Nicholas I by losing it and going down in history as the worst leader Russia had in this century. But the ideas behind Nicholas I's war, which he was prepared to fight against the whole of Europe for his idea of a greater Russia, a Russia which was a civilization more than an empire, of a multinational union of Orthodox believers. You know, that is essentially the mad project on which it seems to me Putin has embarked. The trouble is that narrative has huge traction in Russia, it seems to me, for a number of reasons. Not just because it is built on 19th century imperial historiography, but because that historiography and view of Russia's position in the world and of itself as an empire within the Soviet Union was consolidated by Stalin from very early on. And it then built into the narratives of the Cold War, the West as the enemy, the Soviet Union threatened by the West. And then, of course, as we know, the experience of Russians in the 1990s only reinforced that sense of resentment about the West, which fed Putin's nationalism and his imperial vision to some degree. And so the state has been heavily promoting this narrative, Russia's exceptionalism, its mission in the world, the Russian soul, all of these ideas that consolidate the Putinist regime through propaganda, through film and television, and above all through the mythology of 1945, which is one of these sort of moments of definition for the Russian national identity, previously for the Soviet identity, which Putin uses in a sort of ahistorical way to argue for anything at any one point. A little bit like Stalin's sophistry. I think the metaphor of 1945 serves as a legitimization of whatever Putin wants. But there's another reason, I think, why this narrative has traction and which presents a huge challenge for changing the way the Russians see their history. And that is because it seems to me that the Russian, unlike in Ukraine and the Baltic states, the Russian collective memory is dysfunctional. By which I mean, if we think, people who write about memory, how memory works and how it interacts with history, we tend to think of it as something functioning on three layers. There's an official memory, which is state propaganda, official versions of history. There's individual memory, direct memory, or coming through families, and there's collective memory. And you need a flourishing collective memory through uncensored books, historical research, free expression in film and literature and the sort of books that you write, in order for people to have a conceptual framework to which they can relate their individual memories. And it seems to me that because of the state control of history for the last God knows how many years, apart from that very small time of glasnost, the result is that people tend to fold their individual memories, which can come from traumatic experiences, into the official narrative. So the oral histories that have been done of World War II, the veterans of the war may have seen and experienced traumatic events, but they explain them in a narrative given to them by the state, that it was all for something. Likewise, when I did my oral history of the Stalin period with Memorial, we sent a team to Norilsk. And there we found the same thing, that, you know, these people who were nearly all the descendants of Gulag survivors explained their experience as uprooted people in Norilsk through what they had contributed to the Soviet project. So it's not only a problem of state control of history, it's a problem of the weakness of collective memory, because there's no free functioning sphere of historical discourse. Now that leaves us with the question of what is a usable history today? What, in terms of trying to rebuild Russia's political culture, can we take from Russian history to create a different sense of who the Russians are and what their values are? And it seems to me that here there's, again, a fundamental problem, which is that the usable Russian history has already been used by Ukrainians, by Baltic states, by Georgians, all of whom see the Soviet period as a period of occupation. It wasn't us. This was imposed on us by the Russians. Whereas the Russians have been treated by the West and have, to some extent, taken on the mantle of being the perpetrators of the Soviet system, and were encouraged to see themselves as the main brothers in this family of little brothers that included the Ukrainians. And so, whereas the Ukrainians can build, and have built, it seems, a nationhood, a national identity, a very strong national identity now because of the war, on the Holodomor, for example, the Russians have never really tried to do that with collectivization. My own experience of engagement with Russia as a historian is as a historian of peasant Russia. I worked in the early 1980s with Viktor Petrovich Danilov and Fimov and others in that school of coming out of the Khrushchev years that wanted to reevaluate collectivization. And I was left by that work with no doubt that the absolutely crucial chapter in the history of modern Russia, and I mean Russia now, was collectivization. And I don't think I have ever seen a reckoning with collectivization in Russian society. Indeed, you probably remember around the early 2010s there was a very popular Russian TV show, Sud Vremeni, in which they would debate historical episodes. And when they came to discuss collectivization with expert opinions on either side being put forward about whether it was justified or not, and I thought that the team for the prosecution did very well. Still, in the television polling, 80% thought collectivization was a good idea. 80%. So, if you have that amount of, if you like to adopt the cliche, buy-in to the official narrative of collectivization and an inability to reckon with it, but also not just historically, but to realize that actually what was destroyed there. And what was destroyed in collectivization was the basic unit of Russian political culture. The община, the mir, the village, where some element of civic responsibility developed, which, and I hope we can discuss this, perhaps in 1917, could have come around to produce a different type of democracy. I believe that was really possible in 1917. Even into early 1918, when people like Kamenev were thinking of combining Soviet power with village Soviets entrenched in democratic processes with a constituent assembly. Well, we can debate that, but it seems to me that that is an absolutely crucial element of the Russian political civic potential, which was destroyed by Stalin. So I think it would be very difficult to develop a sense of Russia's historical identity by claiming a sort of narrative of victimhood. So I just read Serhii Plokhy's last book on Ukraine. And that's essentially the story for Ukraine. It's a story of suffering, overcoming suffering. So can the Russians do that? I doubt it very much. So it seems to me that I'll conclude now, but it seems to me, listening to the contributions yesterday and thinking about how can history help here. Of course, history can help by demythologizing all the myths that the Putin regime has put up, all the falsifications that the Putin regime has peddled in terms of its teaching presentation of history. But it seems to me that we also need another crucial element here, which is not to have a big historical narrative, but to be able to draw from history to energize the civic activism that Russia needs in the new generation that might turn to history for examples, for inspiration. We talk about democracy, but, you know, one element of democracy that has been sort of rather neglected in much of the discussion of this issue is accountability. Accountability. What Russia doesn't have is political accountability. And why not? It seems to me that this, again, is a historical issue. The notion of ministerial, any political accountability was deeply rooted in Russian imperial culture. It was there. It was there even as late as 1922, when Lenin no less wrote, in a sort of warning in his new writings about the net, we must remember political responsibility means accountability for your subordinates and what they do. But Stalin built a culture in which that was reversed. Stalin built a political culture in which the subordinate took the blame for any mistakes of the superior. And he did that through his system of compromat, his system of political surveillance, and he built a state on that which, unfortunately, it seems to me, still exists today in terms of accountability. Now, that is, for me, a sort of historically informed element of what it makes for a democratic culture that can be used, historically informed, but can be used to make people think in a more critical way about, well, why is Russia the way it is? Why is there so much corruption? Why do people act with impunity, knowing that the subordinate will take the flag?
I think it is quite strange. I have been listening to London. I am the author of fiction. My views of history and historical processes are less pessimistic. And speaking of why this has happened, the name of Putin has been mentioned by you many times, but I don't have this name circulating in my mind because it seems to me that there are some laws and some rationale logic which is above the will of one person. My explanation of the nuances of what is going on in Russia are as follows. From the midterm historical perspective, what we observe today is the disintegration of the last colonial empire. The reasons why this empire lasted longer than others, there are two reasons for that. First, it was a land empire, so they have not conquered overseas. Their colonies were nearby, within the same land borders, and it was more difficult for these areas to disintegrate for objective reasons. Another explanation is macro-historical. In my view, we observe the end of the huge, over 500-year-old history of the Russian state. In front of our eyes, it's coming to the end. In the second half of the 15th century, the future Russian state separated from the great Asian empire built by Genghis Khan, and the follow-up state rhetoric was claiming itself the third Rome. It was not one, it was the second Karakorum. If we look back at the history of grabbing Russian empire, you will see it was not trying to get into the old areas of the Byzantine Empire. It tried to reach the empire of Genghis Khan from one ocean to the other, and at the peak it managed to conquer all these areas. It was a special type of empire, such huge state formations which unite various diverse multi-language enclaves can exist following one of the two scenarios, either the scenarios of consensus, when each region decides how to live and how to unite into a federal or confederal system like the United States, Or another option is violence, threatening, very harsh centralization. So that was the pathway for the Russian statehood. Russian state is more radical than the absolute monarchies in Europe, because in this system there was no place for anybody, not for aristocracy, nor for krepostnoi. And Ivan III actually enslaved the noble families and they were not free to move. And then it took the peasants in the follow-up. It was a system built on 4 logical and very strong leverages. First, absolute super centralization of power, like tumens, 1000s, hundreds, and tens, like in Genghis Khan times. No separation of powers. Only the Great Khan decides, nobody else. That's the principle of the state. No separation of powers. Second, the state has all the citizens who serve it, and the state becomes a super idea. This is why you can sacrifice. This is what you have to serve, and all the so-called state men believed that the state is above all. And third, the sacral figure of the head of the state, because everything will break down. And this system, it's the fourth, cannot follow the laws. In principle, it cannot be a legal state. There cannot be any independent judicial system. This system has always been guided by decrees and managed by decrees, not by laws. It was more convenient for the authorities, as it was said in the 19th century. The laws were written to subordinates.
Historically, this is a very sustainable system. The entire history of Russia is about trying to remove the system because it's rigid. It prevents the development. But any attempt to weaken this results in the system starting to collapse. This produces panic, and then they re-establish it immediately. So historically, what we are observing, it happened after 1917, when Joseph Stalin brought together the collapsed country by strengthening these 4 pillars. It also happened in 90s, when freedom and separation of powers and independence of judges and freedom of media again started the process of collapse of the country, with local dukes trying to tear the country apart. And then again the reaction came. Yeltsin brought in this strong hand, and this strong hand re-established all 4 pillars within about 10 years. It abolished the local autonomy and the separation of powers. Starting with Yukos, it abolished the independent court and again re-established the holy figure of the ruler. No Putin, no Russia. So it's fully re-established. Using the surplus of money coming from energy resources, the rulers started attempts to restore the previous borders. And this is happening now, actually. And had Putin succeeded with his blitzkrieg in Ukraine, we could be sure that he would act the same way by re-establishing the borders of empire in other regions as well. However, in 21st century, this highly archaic system is not competitive. As we see, it no longer works. It used to work in the 18th century, but in 21st century it doesn't work. And it is doomed to collapse. It's collapsing as we speak. What's happening now is very similar to the situation during the Crimean War, like 1855, when all layers of the country, even the conservative ones, start to realize that it's no longer possible to live like that it will not work, that we have to change it. Other historical parallels that come to my mind are, of course, the Japanese War 1904 to 1905, resulting in disorders. But neither in 1855 nor in 1905 the empire was destroyed, because the ruling clique preserved itself. In 1917, the ruling clique collapsed, so everything collapsed as a result. I'm not sure that this explanation is fully correct, but for me it explains some basic fundamentals. So now let's discuss historical parallels for some more time. I frequently hear, and it seems to me, that the current situation in which Russia is has no historical precedence. It might be a truth if this is really the end of this 500 years of history of Russia, but maybe actually such parallels exist and they might teach us something. I think they do exist.
Draw simple conclusions. I think we are possibly in a 1916 situation. It feels to me like we're somewhere in 1916 with a state empire collapsing and people, divisions in the elite and a growing demoralization of the forces. But the big difference between the situation today and that of Russia in 1917 or 1905 is that in Russia there is no liberal Duma element. There are no elite groups pushing for reform, as there were in 1905 with the liberation movement, the National Zemstva movement, and as there were in 1916 with the progressive bloc in the Duma, with ministers siding with senior generals for palace coup and so on. So I don't see I think you need, for a revolution like 1917 to work, you need a certain synchronicity of actors, of movements for political reform that are still allowed within the regime, as they were in 1916, that can spread panic and division within the elites, and the pressure from below. Now, I think the pressure from below, I don't see any real likelihood, to be honest, of a revolution on the streets. I just don't see it because of just what has happened to Russians over the last 100 years. You know, if you put waves of terror through a society, you know, those 20,000 people who were who were arrested after February 24. I mean, incredibly brave people who went out and demonstrated. But, you know, one crackdown was enough. And I don't see that resurfacing. But for me, the parallel, which I find possibly even exciting, is the soldiers. Because the revolution of February 1917 began in the army. It began with soldiers who did not want to fight anymore, who spread the story of, I mean, it sounds trivial to us, but the story of Rasputin was incredibly powerful in 1916-17. And you know, there was a Duma report in the spring of 1917 saying that in the view of many senior officers, it was the Rasputin story that led to the collapse of the army. Now, that might be an overstatement, but the point is that once soldiers have the sense, well, why are we fighting this? We're just being forced to fight this. Is this a lie? Once that lie can spread to the rear, then there is hope for that to be a political catalyst, it seems to me.
Нам не удастся здесь поспорить, потому что я с этим согласен.
We will not be able to debate over this because I agree on it. And yesterday, when I was discussing the course of action about what is to be done, I was thinking exactly about this. It's only in this regard that the situation of February 1917 is becoming possible. Because in February 1917, the Tsar regime was not removed by the people, not by Bolsheviks or revolutionaries, because all parties were either in Siberia or in emigration. The regime was removed by reserve soldiers of Petrograd who did not want to go to fight to the front line. And in my view, if we speak about the campaigning of democratic forces in Russia, mostly they should be targeting the mobilized people who have arms. Because if after some military defeat or internal crisis they start some rebellion or riots, most likely it would be started by the people who have weapons and who are hard to be controlled or dispersed by Spetsnaz. In terms of 1917, as we know, it ended with a terrible civil war. The question that I keep asking myself, and now I'm actually reading and writing about the events of the Civil War, and of course I find many parallels, and also very deplorable. For example, the disability of liberals who are close to my heart, and them being so unable to keep the power. I think that in 1917 it was not possible to build a democratic country in Russia. I would disagree with you on that.
I think it was possible. I would like to return to my point about the commune, about the Mir, and about the possibility of a different form of democracy to develop. I genuinely believe that as late as you know, that even though the Bolsheviks seized power in a coup, there were still, you know, they had very little control of the areas outside the big cities. And the village Soviets that were being formed were really just politicized village communes with the added element of soldiers returning from the front. The whole of 1917 had been characterized by literally just mass desertion. We still haven't worked out the figures, but mass desertion. And soldiers coming back, fed up with the war, wanting to rebuild their villages and using the kudos they had in the village, the kudos they had as literate peasant sons, to redirect village affairs, often in a violent manner, to ransack estates and even kill the old landowners. But nonetheless, I think that unit of direct, if you like, Soviet democracy, participatory democracy, was livable with the structures of a national parliament and might have suited Russia quite well. Because the Constituent Assembly, which was the dream of the provisional government of liberals from the 19th century, meant very little to people in the village. You know, I mean, we talk about political culture, but it seems to me, as a foreigner, speaking as a foreigner, the thing that characterizes the Russians' relations with the state is that they want to get as far away from it as possible. And what we see now in people running away from mobilization is what we saw, you know, when the state came for them in the 1930s and 40s, or when serfdom was imposed. People just run away. And so there's a sort of anarchist element at the heart of Russian responses to the state. And I think that the Constituent Assembly was the victim of that. So when it was closed down in January 1918, there was very little reaction to it. And the socialist revolutionaries, you know, who retreated to Samara and tried to set up this government based on the Constituent Assembly, they were hopelessly in exile in their own provincial strongholds. because for the peasantry, those national structures meant very little. But I think that the combination of the two could have brought about something different.
Я предлагаю, чтобы мы про это доспорили в свободное.
I suggest that we discuss it when we are free of microphones, because we are now going deep into history, which is of course very interesting to me. But we still have this topic ahead of us, which is highly relevant and should be discussed here, as we still have some time. And this topic is on what? Historically, knowing history, in my view, is necessary for understanding how, especially in critical situation, further developments are possible or impossible, depending on the context of some country, and how these developments will most likely unravel based on its previous historical lines.
Or if not civil war, if the state collapses amidst a military collapse, the disintegration of the state into some form of warlordism. Because here again, the contrast with 1917 is so important. There are no, it seems, there are no, you're all in exile, basically. And there are no liberal progressive forces, parliamentary forces, civic forces to stabilize any political agreed position in Russia at the moment. So if the state collapses amidst a military collapse, I'm very frightened of chaos and if not civil war, which would require different agreed positions to form in blocks as to what they're fighting over, then simply warlordism for who can come out on top in the struggle for power.
Я, исходя из моего понимания, так сказать, российской истории,
based on my understanding of Russian history, I think that this option, which is being actively discussed at this forum of some post-Putin democratic Russia, which will stay in the same borders, I think it's not realistic. Completely unrealistic. In my view, it's not possible. And this is why. Because if Russia stays in its current borders with its current culture, state culture, in very short time, in a free country, separatist movements again will start. It is unavoidable, and 90s will come back. The capital will face a choice, either to see the country disintegrate chaotically, or they should resort to force by stopping being a democracy. So the same will repeat. In a very short time, any democratic president again will turn into Putin, because the architecture of this country does not presume any other options. The rule of law, democracy, or freedom of press is not possible, because it will undermine the whole nature of the ruler. This is not working in the system. I think Russia will only be able to preserve its integrity only in one case, the so-called third option, which is the last one for me. While the first two options, which are likely for me, the best one is if Russia, after the collapse of Putin's regime, and if new political will appears, this will turn this country into federation or confederation, demoscovizing it, so that people live and pay their taxes, work and pay their taxes where they live. And democratic forces, Navalny and Khodorkovsky, They have this point about demuscovitization of Russia, and I think this is the necessary prerequisite of democratic development. This Russia can be democratic in some regions, in other countries, in other regions less democratic, but it would stop being an empire in this scenario. And some regions of Russia would get chance for democratic development. This is the best option, which is very problematic, very complex, but still the best one. The second one, mentioned by Orlando, when the same federalization happens chaotically through civil war, because local elites start competing over resources, and it happens in a country full of nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants with unpredictable consequences. But the third option is even worse, in my opinion, which appears the most realistic to me. As Russia has abandoned its place in the great Asian empire, probably it will come back to it. It will turn back to the great duchy of Moscow under the Chinese empire. It is proceeding there, so probably all decisions are made between Washington and Beijing, and it's moving towards the new Cold War and bipolar world. And in this framework, naturally, to preserve itself, Putin's Russia will need to become the younger partner of China. This is a horrible option for everyone. It's horrible for the world, because any Cold War might lead to the hot war. This is a horrible option for Ukraine, because in this case, Ukraine is the frontier state on the border of this great Asian empire, constantly under stress and in tension. And this is also horrible for Russia, because they would have some digital dictatorship with all those Chinese things and some Russian add-ons. The worst is that this framework will not change after the death of Putin, because Putin's elites would naturally be integrated into this Chinese system, because they are fully fine with this Chinese framework. So, in my view, if some positive changes or shifts don't happen, in some time, Russia comes back to the same place from where they originated in 15th century. So, I'm quite sad about it.
Meta-narratives of Russia's possible development. But I think that looking forward to the discussions we've had about building a new political culture, if there is ever an opportunity to implant it in Russia or to persuade Russians to think differently, then I think I would just like to say that I think it does begin with history. It does begin with history, because this narrative that has fueled these wars. And we're talking about many wars over centuries, because, this war is a continuation of Russian policy, which is driven by geopolitics and its own imperial vision. It's not driven by NATO expansion. That could have been a provocation. But essentially, this war is about the Russian imperial vision and the problem of Russia's borders in the Black Sea area. That is basically the cause of this war, as previous wars of aggression by the Russian state in the 19th and 18th century were.
My feeling is that regarding Russian imperialism, we will soon no longer be concerned, because the Russian imperialism broke its own backbone thanks to the courage of Ukrainian army, and also thanks to its own corrupted and incompetent nature. So the Russian Empire is leaving. It's disappearing. It will be gone. So in my view, this fear remained in 2022, something that seemed so terrible on 24th of February, and even 2 weeks later, when Ukrainians withstood this first blow and they were able to survive. it became clear that they broke the backbone of this empire, and it deserves huge gratitude and respect. But this problem will be replaced by other problems, which in my view will be even more difficult. And it feels that we are not preparing ourselves for this future while we are discussing the great Russia, democratic Russia of tomorrow. And maybe let's discuss something positive and optimistic. Any optimism about Russia?
Is the young. I mean, the elderly, those who were schooled in the Soviet Union, are, I'm afraid, a lost cause, because the propaganda vision of history and of what Russia is too entrenched. It's impossible to counteract that, and probably pointless, because, you know, if we could wave a magic wand and they were all given free, fair elections, they would probably vote for another Putin. So we have to think of the young generation, who are much more sophisticated, able to read critically, open to internet sources across the world, and able to access them because they're savvy. And they have energy, and they don't want to live in Putin's country. They want to live in a free country, at peace with their neighbors. And so this is the generation we need to work on. But as again, I just return to it. I mean, I was involved with the European University of St. Petersburg in trying to help teachers of Russian history at universities to arm themselves with the sort of historical concepts that we use in the West, to try and give them some more sophisticated tools to use for their own teaching. And it proved difficult, but I think that in small deeds projects like that is the way forward. We can't lecture. You know, I mean, I've done a lecture tour of Russia after I published The Whisperers in 2000. I got such hell from Russians telling me, how dare you come and tell us our history? So it's not for the foreigners to or to impose on Russian young people some idea of how they should think about it. All we can do is give them the tools to think for themselves about their history. We can give them the books, we can give them the resources, we can bring them to European universities, give them scholarships, and hopefully one day they will return home and teach a different history.
In my weak moments I also enjoyed. В моменты слабости мне тоже хочется.
When I feel weak, I also want to remove the responsibility from my shoulders to younger generations. But what I want to say is that although the current arithmetics in Russia looks terrible, out of 145 million, only 1 million prefer to leave, while the others, no matter what they think, they remain obedient to this regime, and it looks horrible. But there is also another maths, which makes me optimistic. If we don't watch the entire population of Russia, but we only watch the opinion makers, like journalists, internet celebrities, and the artists, we see that the predominant majority of gifted and active people are on our side, which is a huge force, which unfortunately so far we don't use that much. This is the main battle which is now happening in Russia, this battle for hearts and minds of Russians. No one is better positioned than opinion makers in Russia to cope with this task. In my view, if meetings like this could help coordinate these efforts to build some programs for these people, something could happen, and maybe we will succeed in changing this track of history, which I have recently described. And this is the end of our time. Thank you everyone for your attention.